He bought a ranch to build a resort. But in a locked hangar, he was in for a shock. Cages, blood, and secret journals. He began an investigation, and it reached the FBI. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. Matthew Collins had not been born for the city, or at least that was what he had begun to tell himself after the 10th year of endless deadlines, fluorescent lights, and the glass and steel towers that boxed in his view of the sky. When the idea of buying a ranch first came to him, it had felt less like a business move and more like a rescue of his own restless spirit. Now, as his truck rattled along the dirt road that snaked toward the property, a strange exhilaration gripped him. The horizon stretched in every direction, unbroken but for the distant line of hills. The setting sun threw long gold bars across the land, lighting up the tall grass that swayed like a sea. Dust curled behind him in a soft, lazy plume. The place smelled of sagebrush and sun-baked earth, a smell that felt both foreign and faintly familiar, like something his soul had been missing. The ranch appeared slowly, like a mirage assembling itself from the heat haze. A weathered 2-story house with a sagging porch, a pair of barns crouched low to the ground, several outbuildings leaning at uneasy angles, and the long fence lines that stretched beyond sight. It was quiet, except for the groan of old wood and the whisper of the wind. Matthew parked near the house and stepped out, feeling the crunch of gravel under his boots. The silence was almost too complete, as if the land was holding its breath. Jed Crawford, the previous owner, was waiting for him on the porch. The man looked as though he had been carved from the same weathered wood as the house, thin but wiry, skin browned and creased from years under the sun, his hat casting a shadow over pale, watchful eyes. His handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. There was no joy in his face at the sale, only a grim resignation. He led Matthew around the property, pointing out the wells, the stables, the fences that would need mending. His words were clipped, efficient, and carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime speaking only when necessary. When they reached the far end of the yard, Jed slowed near a long, low structure set apart from the other buildings. Its corrugated metal siding gleamed dully, the padlocked doors facing away from the house. Jed stopped walking, planted the end of his cane in the dirt, and said in a voice that carried no room for argument that this particular building was off limits. He would be removing some personal equipment from inside, he said, and Matthew could have the place once it was cleared. There was something in Jed's tone, something steely and final, that made Matthew nod without question. It wasn't until later that the words would echo back to him and feel more like a warning than a simple request. The paperwork was signed that evening at the old wooden kitchen table. Matthew felt the weight of the deed in his hands and an unfamiliar swell of pride in his chest. This land was his now. He imagined the changes he would make, the house restored to its former glory, the barns repurposed, the grounds filled with visitors who would come to taste a piece of the Old West. In his mind, he saw children riding ponies under the open sky, tourists drinking sarsaparilla at a saloon bar he would build himself, the crackle of campfires at dusk. He could already picture brochures advertising a true frontier experience. This would not just be a business, it would be a legacy. His partner and old friend, Lance Harper, arrived the following morning. Lance had once worn a sheriff's badge, and though he had left law enforcement years ago, it clung to him in the way he moved and looked at the world. His easy drawl and steady presence grounded Matthew, reminding him that dreams still required practical foundations. Lance walked the property with a careful eye, pointing out weak fence posts and rotting beams, assessing what would need repair. When they reached the locked metal building, Lance paused. He bent down, studied the padlock, then straightened with a slow frown. Strange to leave personal gear behind, he said under his breath. Matthew brushed it off, but the comment lodged somewhere in the back of his mind, like a burr. The first weeks passed in a blur of work. Contractors came to inspect the house. Surveyors measured the land. Matthew spent long hours at the kitchen table with papers and plans, sketching layouts for guest cabins, imagining a corral for horseback rides, a shooting range, and an open-air dance floor for live music on summer nights. The dream was taking shape faster than he had expected, and yet, for all his excitement, he could not shake the prickling sensation that the property held stories he did not yet know. The locals were friendly but cautious. In town, when he mentioned the ranch he had bought, conversations had a way of pausing for a fraction of a second before resuming with polite smiles. More than once he caught people exchanging glances when he told them which parcel of land he owned. One old man at the feed store muttered that he hoped Matthew had a strong stomach, then refused to explain what he meant. It was Lance who first voiced what Matthew was beginning to feel, that the land remembered things, and that perhaps some of those memories were better left undisturbed. The first truly unsettling night came in the third week. The moon hung low, painting the yard silver, and Matthew woke with the uneasy sense that something was moving outside. He lay still, listening. There was no sound of an engine, no human voice, only a faint metallic clatter, like a chain being dragged, followed by a sound that made his blood run cold. A low, guttural growl that echoed from the direction of the locked building. It rose, then cut off abruptly, leaving the night impossibly silent. Lance, sleeping in the next room, heard it too, and in the morning he said little, but his jaw was tight, and he suggested Matthew check the padlock on the building. When Matthew walked out to the far edge of the yard, the sun barely rising, he saw that the dirt near the doors was freshly disturbed, as though tires had rolled through sometime during the night. The padlock was clean, almost too clean, its brass shining as if it had just been oiled. He crouched, touched the cool metal, and felt an unshakable awareness settle in his chest. Jed Crawford was gone. This was his land now, and yet someone had been here, recently. Someone who had business behind those doors. He stood up slowly, the early morning light stretching his shadow long across the ground. Something was wrong here, something that ran deeper than rotting fences or leaking roofs. He told himself that Jed would return soon to clear out whatever was inside, that there was a harmless explanation for everything. But the silence of the land did not feel harmless. It felt watchful, waiting. And though he turned back toward the house, toward coffee and blueprints and the illusion of normalcy, the image of the locked building stayed with him like a thorn in the flesh. By the time the sun set again, Matthew had made up his mind that he would not be kept from any part of the property he now owned. Whatever was behind those doors, he would find out, even if he did not like the answer. The decision did not come easily, though by the next night it felt inevitable. The thought of that shining padlock had followed Matthew through the entire day, distracting him even when contractors came by to talk about plumbing upgrades and fencing repairs. Every time he looked out the window and saw the low silhouette of the metal building, a chill moved along his spine. It no longer felt like just a storage shed. It felt like a secret that pressed against the walls, straining to be uncovered. When evening fell and the sky turned the color of bruised purple, Matthew found himself standing in the yard, hands shoved into his pockets, staring across the distance to the locked doors, as though they might reveal their contents if he glared hard enough. Lance joined him, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. The former sheriff was a man who had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and he didn't like what they were telling him. There was something too deliberate about the way Jed had insisted on that building being off limits. There was something too fresh about the tracks they had seen that morning. If the old man had truly planned to return and clean out the place, why hadn't he told them when? Why did it look as though someone had been there last night, not weeks ago? Lance said little, but the look in his eyes was enough to confirm what Matthew had already decided. They would open the building. They waited until full dark, not because they expected to be seen, but because some instinct told them that this was something that belonged to the night. The stars burned sharp overhead, the moon casting a pale glow across the fields. The air was cool and dry, filled with the faint smell of dust and cut hay. Matthew carried a heavy flashlight, its beam slicing through the shadows like a spear of white. Lance brought along a pry bar and a pair of bolt cutters he had retrieved from the back of his truck. When they reached the building, the silence felt so thick that it seemed to hum in their ears. Matthew touched the padlock, and it swung slightly under his fingers. There was no mistaking it. It was recent, polished, like something a man still used and maintained. Lance crouched, slipped the bolt cutters into place, and with a firm snap, the lock fell away, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Matthew's stomach knotted, but it was too late to turn back. The doors groaned as they pulled them open, revealing a black interior that swallowed the moonlight whole. The smell hit first, a hot, coppery stench of blood mixed with something acrid, like urine and rust. Matthew nearly gagged. He raised the flashlight, and the beam swept across the space. At first it looked like a warehouse, a wide expanse of concrete floor, stacks of wood and metal along the sides. But then the light caught on the outlines of cages, dozens of them, some large enough to hold a horse, others just big enough for a dog. The cages were empty now, but the story of what had been inside them was written everywhere. The floors were scratched and stained. The metal bars were bent in places. Claw marks raked down them deep enough to leave permanent scars. Chains dangled from hooks in the ceiling, some ending in heavy iron collars that clinked softly as the wind moved through the open doorway. A work table stood to one side, littered with objects that made Matthew's stomach turn. Muzzles, whips, a cattle prod, bottles of sedatives with faded labels, a blood-stained harness. He walked deeper inside, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his grip. There was an area near the back that looked like a pen for separating animals. The smell there was worse. In one corner lay a pile of bones, most clearly from animals, but mixed among them were scraps of leather and something that looked horribly like a human boot, half buried in straw. Matthew knelt, reached out, then pulled back his hand as if burned. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. Whatever had happened here had been cruel and relentless. On a shelf nearby lay a ledger, its leather cover cracked with age. He opened it and shone the light over the pages. Inside were lists written in neat, clinical handwriting. Date of capture, species, notes about temperament. Words leapt off the page at him, broken. Resists training, disposed. There were symbols next to certain entries, and Matthew realized with a sick twist that they indicated whether the animal had been sold or killed. Lance stood silently, taking everything in. His jaw clenched so hard that the muscles stood out along his neck. He had seen violent things before in his years of law enforcement, but this was different. This was systematic. This was industry. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't survival. It was turning wild creatures into commodities. Matthew shut the ledger and straightened, his breath coming shallow and fast. He had come to this ranch to build a dream, to create a place where families could ride horses and eat chuck wagon dinners and pretend, just for a few days, that they had stepped back into a simpler time. But this place was not simple, was soaked in something dark, something that made his vision of a cheerful Wild West suddenly feel grotesque. He turned slowly, letting the light travel across the cages one last time, seeing now not just metal and concrete, but the ghosts of every terrified creature that had been held here. Outside, the night seemed colder when they stepped back into it. The padlock lay on the ground, a dull piece of metal that no longer held its power. Matthew felt hollow, as if the discovery had taken something out of him. He looked at Lance, and in the dim light of the moon, he saw the same grim understanding reflected in his friend's face. They could not pretend they hadn't seen this. They could not simply board the doors, back up, and go on with their plans. As they walked back toward the house, the crunch of gravel underfoot loud in the silence, Matthew felt the ranch itself watching them. The old fences, the leaning barns, the house with its dark windows, they all seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. There would be no turning away now. This was his land. Its history, however ugly, was now tied to his name. And before he built anything new here, he would have to uncover every secret it was hiding. The house felt different the next morning, as though a film of dust had settled over it during the night. Matthew woke early, the images of the cages and the ledger still playing behind his eyes. He sat for a long time at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in his cup, staring at the deed to the property as though it might offer him answers. This was supposed to have been a clean purchase, a fresh start. Instead, it felt like he had inherited a crime scene. The idea of building a cheerful tourist destination here now seemed obscene, like painting flowers over a grave. Lance arrived from the barn, his hat pulled low, his face grim. He didn't have to say anything. Matthew could tell from the look in his eyes that he'd been turning it over in his mind all night as well. Over breakfast, they spoke little, but by the time the plates were cleared, the decision was made. They would not ignore what they had seen. They would find out where the animals had come from, who had taken them, and who had bought them once they were broken. Lance started with the contacts he still had in law enforcement, placing a few careful calls to men he trusted. At first, the responses were cautious. The ranch had a reputation, he was told, but nothing concrete had ever been pinned to Jed Crawford or anyone else connected with the place. There were rumors, yes, whispers of wild animals going missing from nearby reserves, of big cats vanishing from state parks, even of a few livestock killings that had been blamed on predators, but left strangely human-looking tracks near the sites. Some cases had been opened and quietly closed. Others had never been investigated at all. Matthew began his own search through the property, walking fence lines, looking for hidden gates or trails. It was on the second afternoon that he found what looked like the faint remains of a tire track, leading away from the back of the metal building toward a narrow dirt road that cut into the hills. The path was partly overgrown, as if someone had tried to let it vanish, but the ground still held the impression of heavy wheels. He knelt and brushed away some loose earth, finding a fresher mark beneath. Someone had been using this road not long ago. That night, they decided to watch. They parked Lance's truck far enough away to stay hidden and waited in silence as the moon rose. Hours passed, the night stretching long and still, until at last they heard the distant rumble of an engine. A pair of headlights appeared on the horizon, growing closer until a boxy truck rolled slowly into view. It passed them and stopped by the building. Two men climbed out, their figures stark in the moonlight, and one of them unlocked the doors. The beam of a flashlight flickered inside. A few minutes later, they re-emerged carrying something, large metal crates that they loaded into the truck bed. Matthew's pulse hammered. There was no doubt left now. The building was still being used, even after the sale. This was not a closed chapter of history, but an ongoing operation. He and Lance exchanged a look, and without words, they agreed to follow. They waited until the truck pulled away, then started the engine and kept a careful distance, letting the dust trail guide them. The road wound through the hills, growing narrower until it led into a small canyon where the truck finally stopped. From the cover of some scrub trees, they watched as the men opened a gate and drove inside a fenced area hidden from casual view. What lay beyond the gate made Matthew's blood run cold. Even in the dim light, he could see enclosures, rows of cages similar to those they had seen in the building, only these were not empty. Shapes moved inside, pacing restlessly, and the sounds carried faintly through the night. Low growls, the snap of teeth, the soft, miserable whines of creatures that had forgotten how to be wild, but had not yet learned to be tame. Lance took photographs using the long lens of a camera he had brought for just this purpose. They captured the truck, the faces of the men, the cages, the crude wooden pens, the feeding stations littered with bones. When they were sure they had enough, they retreated back to the ranch, both men silent, their minds racing with what they had seen. The following days became a blur of evidence gathering. Matthew spent hours going through the ledger they had taken from the building, comparing dates and entries, trying to piece together a timeline. Some of the animals had been captured years ago, others only months. The pattern suggested a steady supply, not random incidents. Lance used his connections to quietly run the names of several ranch hands who had once worked for Jed. More than one had been linked to poaching cases in neighboring counties. A few had even served short jail terms, but had always returned to the area afterward. Then the retaliation began. One morning, Matthew found the windows of the house smashed, glass glittering like ice across the porch. A dead fox had been left hanging from the front gate, its body stiff, its throat slit. The message was clear: stop digging. But Matthew had passed the point of turning back. The anger that had been simmering in him since the night they opened the building now burned with cold clarity. They took greater precautions, locking the house at night, keeping their weapons close. Lance insisted on setting watch in shifts, patrolling the property to make sure no one tried to set fire to the buildings. Their caution was justified when, just 3 nights later, they caught the faint glow of fire from the direction of one of the old barns. They raced there in time to put it out before it spread. But the damage was done. The threat had become action. Matthew began to feel the weight of isolation. The town was polite but distant, the neighbors unfriendly once they realized he was digging into the ranch's past. Rumors began to spread that he was a meddler, that he was trying to stir up trouble, that he would bankrupt himself before he ever opened his tourist resort. Offers were quietly made to buy the ranch back from him, offers far above what he had paid. He refused them all. Every refusal seemed to deepen the hostility that now pressed in from every side. It was during one of their night patrols that Lance discovered the final piece they needed. Near the edge of the property, hidden under a loose sheet of corrugated metal, he found an old tin box. Inside was a map, yellowed and fragile, showing locations marked with red X's, remote canyons, dry creek beds, abandoned line shacks. Scribbled notes in the margin indicated holding pens and shipment points. One note was fresher, written in a sharper hand. Transfer by month's end. Matthew traced the lines of the map with one finger, feeling a grim resolve settle over him. They had proof now, enough to bring to the authorities. But more importantly, they had a chance to save whatever animals were still alive in those hidden pens. If they waited, they risked losing everything: the evidence, the creatures, perhaps even their own lives. The night before they set out, Matthew stood again at the edge of the yard, looking toward the locked building. It no longer frightened him the way it once had. It felt instead like a witness, silent and unblinking, demanding that he finish what he had started. Tomorrow they would go into the hills. Tomorrow they would bring this operation into the light. Dawn came cold and sharp, as if the land itself was bracing for what was about to happen. Matthew barely slept, lying awake through the long hours of night. The map unfolded on the table beside him. Each red X seemed to pulse in the lamplight like a warning. By the time the first pale streaks of morning touched the sky, he was dressed and ready, his resolve set. Lance met him at the porch, carrying a rifle slung over his shoulder, and the same grim determination on his face. Neither man spoke much as they loaded the truck with supplies, ropes, canteens, the camera, and enough ammunition to hold their ground if things went wrong. They did not speak of fear, though both felt it pressing in on them. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a confrontation. The road into the hills was rough, little more than a pair of ruts winding through sage and stone. As they drove, the air grew colder, the silence heavier. The rising sun cast long shadows across the ravines, and now and then Matthew thought he saw movement far off, as if someone was watching them from a ridge. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other near the pistol on the seat beside him. There was no telling how far the network of men involved in this operation reached. If they had been willing to burn a barn, they might be willing to do worse. By mid-morning, they reached the canyon marked with the freshest note on the map. They left the truck hidden behind a stand of scrub oak and continued on foot. The ground sloped downward, the path narrowing between walls of stone until the air grew still and shadowed. Ahead, Matthew heard it, the sound of restless movement, the scrape of claws against metal, and then a low, hollow cry that raised the hair on his arms. The first enclosure came into view, a crude pen reinforced with heavy wire. Inside paced a pair of wolves, ribs showing beneath their matted fur, their eyes reflecting the light like twin lanterns. Beyond them were more cages, some holding foxes, others empty but still stinking of confinement. Matthew's heart clenched at the sight. These were the survivors, the ones not yet sold, not yet disposed of. He took photograph after photograph, documenting every pen, every animal, every brand mark burned into the wooden posts. Lance moved methodically, searching for any sign of recent activity, and found fresh tracks near the feed shed. The men who had been here the other night would surely return soon. The first sign of trouble came as they were preparing to cut the lock on one of the cages to free a pair of battered coyotes. The distant hum of an engine echoed through the canyon, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Matthew's stomach turned to ice. He and Lance exchanged a quick look, then retreated into the shadows near a cluster of rocks. A few minutes later, a truck rolled into view, followed by another. 3 men climbed out, one of them unmistakably Jed Crawford, his frame still wiry, his face like leather left too long in the sun. He looked around with the air of a man checking on valuable merchandise, not living creatures. The men began unloading supplies, sacks of grain, chains, tools. One of them walked toward the pens, and the animals shrank back, whimpering. Matthew's hand tightened around his pistol. He could feel the heat of his anger rising, threatening to boil over. But Lance put a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. They needed to wait. They needed to make sure they had the evidence, and, more importantly, that they lived to get it into the right hands. Then one of the men spotted the footprints near the cages. He called out sharply, gesturing to the others, and suddenly the canyon felt much smaller. Jed's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the ground. He barked an order, and the men spread out, searching for intruders. Matthew and Lance crouched lower, every muscle tense. For a long moment, it seemed they might go unnoticed, until a glint from the camera lens betrayed them. A shout rang out, and the men rushed toward the rocks. The next minutes were a blur of motion and sound. Matthew fired a warning shot into the air, buying them a moment's hesitation. Lance shouted for them to stay back, but the men kept coming. The air filled with the thunder of boots and the shouts of curses. Matthew and Lance retreated deeper into the canyon, using the boulders for cover. The sound of gunfire cracked against the stone walls, chips of rock flying. It was a desperate dance, each second stretching into eternity as they tried to hold off the attackers. Then, over the chaos, came another sound, the distant wail of sirens. Dust rose at the canyon entrance as two green and white trucks came into view, emblazoned with the insignia of the Federal Wildlife Service. Armed rangers spilled out, their rifles raised, their voices commanding everyone to drop their weapons. The fight ended as abruptly as it had begun. Jed cursed under his breath, but did not resist as the rangers closed in and put him in cuffs. The other men followed, some protesting, others sullenly silent. The rangers moved quickly through the site, photographing everything, cataloging evidence, sedating the weakest animals for transport. Matthew felt a strange mix of triumph and grief as he watched. They had stopped this place from operating another day, but the scars on the creatures and on this land would take far longer to heal. One of the rangers, a stern woman with a clipboard, assured Matthew that the surviving animals would be taken to sanctuaries where they could recover, and that federal charges would be brought against every man involved. When it was over, and the trucks had driven away with the prisoners and the rescued animals, the canyon fell silent again. Matthew stood among the empty pens, breathing the still, dry air, feeling the weight of everything they had uncovered. He realized he had no desire to erase what had been here. This story needed to be told. The world needed to know what had happened so that it would not happen again. Back at the ranch, as evening settled over the fields, Matthew walked one last time to the metal building that had started it all. Its doors stood open now, the interior bare and echoing. He stood in the doorway, imagining the future. The building would not be torn down. It would be transformed, not into a barn, not into storage, but into a place where people could come and learn about the animals that had suffered here, about the importance of protecting the wild rather than breaking it. Lance joined him, leaning against the doorframe, and for the first time in weeks, there was something almost like peace on his face. They spoke quietly of what would come next: exhibits, educational programs, partnerships with wildlife organizations. The dream of a tourist attraction was not gone, only reshaped. This would be a place of remembrance and renewal, a place where the sound of fear would be replaced with the sound of children learning and laughing. As darkness fell and the first stars came out, Matthew felt the knot in his chest loosen. The land no longer seemed watchful in the same threatening way. It seemed instead to breathe easier, as though relieved that its secret had been brought into the open. For the first time since he had arrived, Matthew felt that this ranch truly belonged to him, not because he had bought it, but because he had fought for it, and for everything it stood for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he allowed himself to stand quietly in the cooling air, listening to the distant song of coyotes in the hills, and think of a future where their voices would never again be silenced. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.